بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم افتح لنا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الكرام. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Just a few things about yesterday. When he said, mentioned about وَمَسُّ فَخْذِهِ لَدَيْهِ مُحَضِّرٌ لكن الأصح في الكشف الثقل. They mentioned that he mentions that touching the thigh is not permissible for somebody who's not a mahram, but the exposure of the thigh amongst the khasa. I know in Syria they say when they go swimming with shorts, they say على المذهب المالكي, so which isn't totally accurate. But the Malikis have the fakhad is considered mukhaffafa, and they say amongst the khasa, you know, your friends, your close friends, that if you had a short where your thigh was exposed, that it's makruh. It doesn't go under the prohibition. So that does occur sometimes. And the Prophet ﷺ also praised women that wore the sarwal, pants under their garments, if they obviously if they could afford it, if they were able to. But to not wear pants is problematic if it's windy or something like that, because their aura can be exposed. So it's actually good to wear something under. And this was actually in traditional Western society. The women always wore something under their dresses to make sure that if they weren't exposed. And the same is true for the izar. In some cultures they wear a lungi and they don't really wear underwear with it. It's very easy to have your aura exposed. So it's important for people to be aware of that, because it's about the human dignity. And this is a time when people don't really care about how they dress. In the past, people always dressed well. Even if they were poor people, they tried to dress well. And the basic principle today is that you dress for yourself. That's what people say, which is very consistent with the age we're living in, which is an age of the self. So everything's done for the self. Whereas in traditional cultures, people actually dress thinking of other people. It's the same reason that you wear perfume. Perfume, some of the ulama didn't consider spending a lot of money to be israf or to be extravagant if it was for perfume. And the idea was that perfume is actually a charity for other people. So because after you smell it, you don't smell the perfume that's on you. It goes after the first. But when you are in a group, people will smell it. Even after a period of time, they can smell the perfume. So it's a type of charity to other people, actually. So that's what he's warning about there. So... And then we did so where did we end? Bismillah.
وكل ما جاز إليه النظر نظره مع تلذذ حظر وكل ما نظره ممتنع نظره لضرر متسع.
ممتنع. So end on the
ممتنع.
ممتنع.
نظره لضرر متسع. As for everything that is permissible to look upon, if there is sexual pleasure in it, then it is prohibited in any case. Also concerning everything, the viewing of which is proscribed, when the necessity to do so arises, there is legal flexibility.
So we talked about the triaging that the usuli scholars do. So basically a medical examination is permissible for a need for it. It's obviously, they encourage these checkups every 6 months or every year for different things. Dentists, they say you should go every 6 months. A physician, I think they recommend once a year. Is that right? Every 2 years? Okay, depending on age, yeah. So for young people, don't worry about it. Better off not seeing a doctor. They'll usually find something that you wouldn't know anyway. Suddenly you're under the table and under the knife on the table. So, you know, it's permissible to if they need to see something, to check to make sure that there's not anything that's harmful. But a woman should see a female physician, and that's why it's important to have female physicians, and males should see male physicians unless there's an absolute necessity, especially in the OBGYN area, where it's amazing, you know, it's amazing that it's not completely run by women, because it should be. You know, especially for childbirth, to have a male physician in there. Sometimes it's you know, because you go unexpectedly to a hospital and you'll get a male physician, so it's better to work with a female physician or with a midwife, which is a very viable option if you don't have any problems with your pregnancy. So just not exposing that nakedness for a reason other than a haja or a darura. For the tahsina, it's not considered permissible. So if somebody wants cosmetic surgery, it's not permissible to go and most of those surgeries that they do are harmful for the people. So next one.
ومس ذي المحرم للمحارم ومسها له برأي يأتمي. As for touching one's unmarriageable relatives, the ruling follows that of what one is permitted to look at.
So what you know, the maharam can actually touch, they can hold hands, they can give a hug, something like that. But the skin, they shouldn't touch the actual flesh unless it's from the forearm and obviously the head. Those are the, so they could, you know, hug or kiss just like you would a sister or somebody that's not marriageable. But an inappropriate hug or a kiss would not obviously be included in that. And then again, you get people that get more strict because of the facade of the time, the corruption that you have. Go ahead, next one.
تم صوان المرء مع أدران بصره والسمع واللسان من صانه سلم من تفاوت يصيبه من أحد الثلاثة. The protection of a man from the evils of his sight, sound, and tongue have been completed. Whoever protects them is safe from any fault of one of the three afflicting him.
There's there's one missing in there. وَاعْلَمْ بِأَنَّ حُرُمَاتَ الرَّأْيِ لَا تَتَقَيَّدْ بِحُسْنِ الرِّئِ. And what that means is that the things that are prohibited to look at are not limited to the pleasure. What's that? Oh, it's the next line? Okay, so they're mixed there. So why don't you read that one first?
وَاعْلَمْ بِأَنَّ حُرُمَاتِ الرَّأْيِ لَا تَتَقَيَّدْ بِحُسْنِ الرِّئِ فملاقيك والحرام فمقلتيك والحرام إن يبن كوع عجوز أو حراقف يفن. And know that forbidden sights are not according to the beauty of what is seen. Beware your eyes in the forbidden, even if it be the wrist of an elderly woman or the silhouette of hips.
So what he's saying there is that just because something is like there's a fitna in it and that's the prohibition, it doesn't mean that it's permissible to look at things that are not beautiful. Like for instance, looking at the so'a, it goes under the same category, whether you're attracted to it or whether you're not. That's the point. So even if you're not attracted to it, it's not permissible to look at it. And then he says that, the muqlatain are your two eyes. So looking at what's haram, even if it's the wrist of an old woman, or there's what's the translation say there? For the second part of that? Ku'u ajuzan or haraqifu yathan. It should be yathan with a fatha.
Yafan, the wrist of an elderly woman or the silhouette of hips.
Yeah, okay. That's a dainty translation. Yeah, silhouette of hips. It's a little more literal than that, but anyway. So what he's saying is, don't look at, even if it's an older person, you have respect for what's not permitted to look at. And next one.
جمعه محمد مولود أناله أماله الودود. These rules were gathered by Muhammad Mawlud. May the loving Lord grant him all his hopes.
So تم صوان المرء من أدران بصره والسمع واللسان. So he's completed this book on what is not permitted to say or to look at or to listen to, and he ends it by just reminding you that it was Muhammad Mawlud that did it, and that's to ask for your dua, because these people, when they do these works, they do them for the sake of Allah, and they want the barakah of these things to continue on. And so he's asking a dua there, may al-Wadud, the loving Lord, give him all of his hopes or his wishes, his amal. So this is the completion of this text, and it's a really interesting text, because as we said, we talked about at the outset of this, I mentioned the hadiths that relate to the tongue, and one of them was Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu. There's a hadith that Abu Hanifa adds to the 4 hadiths that Imam Abu Dawood mentioned, that were the hadith which would suffice any Muslim in his life. So Abu Dawood radiallahu anhu said that he gathered 500,000 hadith, and from that 500,000 he put the hadith in his collection of the Sunan of Abi Dawood, and which are a few thousand. And from those, he said, it suffices a Muslim 4 hadith. And the first one, he said, was إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, which is basically tasheehul ibadat. It's to rectify your worship with your Lord, because actions are by intention. So anything that you intend, that you're getting the intention of it, irrespective of the action, which is why people can do wrong things for the right reasons, and they can do the right things for the wrong reasons. So everything is based on intention. And obviously, for an action to be acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it has to be done with the right intention. It has to be done according to the sharia. In other words, it has to be from the permissible things, either things we've been commanded to do, encouraged to do, or permitted to do. It can't be from those things that are reprehensible or were discouraged to do, or those things that were prohibited to do. And then that it has to be done with sound belief. So you have to be doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's not simply, that sounds like the first one, a right intention, but you can have a good intention, but your belief is not correct. And this is where you come into what's bid'ah. And shaitan is ya'isa an yu'bad fi jazirat al-Arab. He is despaired of being worshipped on the Arabian Peninsula, shaitan. The Prophet ﷺ made it sure that shaitan would not be worshipped on the Arabian Peninsula. So, but he is content with sowing dissension amongst you. So that's a hadith where shaitan will sow dissension, and that's good enough for him. If that's the best he can get, he'll settle for that. But if shaitan does not get kufr from a person, this is the best thing that he can do. The best thing is atheism, disbelief. And then a religion that's off the path, so a religion that's gone astray. Because Christians still believe in Allah, they believe in God, Jews believe in God, but the religious practice is not in accordance with the prophetic tradition anymore. And it was, according to our belief, nullified and abrogated by the Islamic tradition. So then, for the believers, if they're Muslim, then what he wants is ma'asiyah. If he can't get disbelief, he'll settle for ma'asiyah. If he can't get ma'asiyah, then he'll settle for bid'ah, right? So there's a lot of people doing things that they think are drawing them close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they're not, because they're innovative things. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man ahdatha fi amrina hadha ma laysa minhu fahuwa raddun." Whoever innovates something in our religion that's not from it, then it's completely rejected. And there's some people that use this word bid'ah, and they have a very limited understanding of it, and so they condemn everything that Muslims do as innovation. There's people out there that do that, and they call everybody who doesn't agree with them mubtadi'. The bid'ah is clearly defined by our ulama. It goes under 5 categories. There's bid'ah wajiba, there's bid'ah manduba, there's bid'ah mubaha, there's bid'ah makruha, and there's bid'ah muharrama. And to say that because kullu bid'atan dalala is kullu bid'atan muharrama is dalala. And the Prophet ﷺ, his language is, you have to read what the ulama say about the language, because you'll go astray if you try to take hadith, your rulings directly from hadith or Quran without the means of the scholars. Many examples of that, because the language of the Quran and the language of the hadith is elliptical, which means that there's a lot of hadf. In rhetoric, the Arabs use what's called ijaz, which is very concise language. So there's a lot of lacunae in the Quran, there's a lot of lacunae in hadith that are fleshed out in the sayings of the commentators on them. They will flesh those hadiths out for you. And so the Prophet ﷺ, when he said kullu bid'atan dalala, there's a difference between a bid'ah shar'iyya, a bid'ah lughawiyya, a bid'ah urfiyya. There are different types of bid'ah. And this is why Omar, when he gathered everybody under one imam, because during the Ramadan they were praying, several different groups were praying in the masjid. And he gathered them all under one imam. And he said, what a good bid'ah this is. Right? Because that hadn't been done before him. But that's not a bid'ah shar'iyya, because he was taking something that is from the religion. Man ahdatha fi amrina hadha ma laysa minhu. What's not from it. He didn't say man ahdatha fi amrina hadha fahuwa raddun. Whoever brings something new in our religion, it's rejected. And people that think that are fools, because first of all, those same people are looking at their watch saying, oh brother, it's time for dhuhr. Ya akhi, bid'ah. Now, why are you, dhuhr telling you now, your watch is telling you, and then that's a kafir watch. It was made in Switzerland by kuffar. So now you're having kuffar tell you what the prayer time is? La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Brother. Huh? It's crazy. So, and then you drive to the masjid. Astaghfirullah, brother, where's your donkey? Can't drive to the masjid, and that's made by Ford. It's a kafir company. And then you bought the gas from Standard. It's kafir country, brother. What are you doing? You got feet, you could walk. Why are you driving a car? It's bid'ah. None of the Sahaba went to the masjid in a car. And certainly not with leather seats and that fancy, right? This is the type of madness that we're living in now, is that people don't think things through. So the bid'ah is clear, but you have to watch out for bid'ah because it's real. And you shouldn't belittle it either. The bid'ah is a very serious thing. And shaitan, that's what he will get from the people, is he'll create innovation in their religion. But if you look at the early community, Imam al-Ghazali mentions the first innovations that entered in were, one of them was sifted bread. So the bread was actually didn't have any bran in it. That was considered a bid'ah, to eat bread without bran. Dr. Aisha said, the whiter the bread, the sooner you're dead. Right? That's medical advice. So eating, and Sayyidina Umar said, "La tarmun nakhala fa innaha min at-ta'am." Don't throw the bran out because it's part of the food. And you need at least 30 grams of fiber a day. Is that right? Yeah. 30 grams. You've got people now that they're not well. People, they're not healthy because they don't eat healthy food. And so then they get colon cancer. You don't have colon cancer in places where they have high fiber diets. It doesn't happen. People don't get sick from that. So that was a bid'ah, right? To eat white bread and then to pray on prayer mats. These were considered innovations. To eat on a table, these were considered innovations by the early community. So it's just very important to recognize that that's a bid'ah makruha. It's not bid'ah muharrama. Even in the Maliki madhab, to pray on something that is nice or luxurious is makruh. It's considered makruh. So it's a bid'ah to pray on a carpet. But now all the masjids have carpets, and it's become the norm in the Muslim countries. If you go to the Maliki countries, if you go to Morocco, for instance, they pray on straw mats. Lahsir. Yeah, do they do that in Sudan? Yeah, in Sudan. So in Maliki countries, they pray on mats. And then they bring in the carpets in wintertime because it's very cold on the floor. And so now the karahiyya is removed because of the illah of buruda. This is the way these men and some of the women that were part of that community, the scholastic community, this is the way they were trained to think. And that's why the religion is a sophisticated religion. You just have to be careful because there's a lot of people that want to reduce it down to a very simple religion that is just a set of rules that don't have a methodology behind them, maqasid, the aims and imports, the purposes of the rules. So one of the biggest enemies that we have is the tongue. And these rules that you've gone over, a lot of people don't know these rules, they don't have access, so we're blessed to have been able to, first of all, be exposed to this, but now it becomes a hujjah against us, and this is where the problem arises. In some ways, it's better to be ignorant of things, right? Like the Eskimo, when the Christians went up. You know about the Eskimo? The Christian told him, you have to become Christian. And the Eskimo said, why? He said, because you're going to go to hell if you're not. Now, that's problematic for Eskimos, but if you've ever read The Cremation of Sam McGee, you'll know what I'm talking about. But he said, well, what happens if I just lived here and I never heard about it? And he said, no, then you'll be forgiven. So he said, then why are you telling me? All right? So... So now you know. I mean, this is the problem. The knowledge, on the one hand, we have to learn because we're obliged to. We also have to spread that knowledge because Allah didn't create people just to live in igloos and eat fish. Right? They're created to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is why you take the message even to the furthest corners of the earth. But this knowledge comes with a price, and the price is that if you don't practice it, you're in bigger trouble. than people that don't know it and might have an excuse with their Lord on the Yawm al-Qiyamah. So it's very important to remember that these are made to be practiced. The nice thing is you've learned them all right before Ramadan, and the fasting is going to help you, inshallah, to practice them, because fasting is a discipline. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. In order for you to learn taqwa. And Ibn Ashar in his Urjuza, he said, وَحَاصِلُ التَّقْوَى اجْتِنَابٌ وَابْتِثَالٌ فِي ظَاهِرٍ وَبَاطِنٍ بِذَا تُنَالٌ. That taqwa is ijtinab and imtithal fi zahiran wa batinan. It's to do what Allah has told you and to avoid what He's prohibited inwardly and outwardly. So to do it inwardly and outwardly. And the first thing he says, that يغض عينيه عن المحارم, right? يكف لسانه عن المآثم, guarding the eyes and the tongue, right? Guarding the eyes and the tongue. So avoiding those things. يكف سمعه عن المآثم. So to avoid listening to those prohibitions, كغيبة نميمة زور كذب لسانه أحرى بترك ما جلب. So he should not listen to anything like ghiba, backbiting, namima, which is trying to sow dissension between people, zur, which is a false testimony, kidhib, which are lies. And then he says that the tongue, it's more appropriate that you avoid saying them. You know, in other words, it's more important that you avoid saying them than hearing them, but hearing them is also sinful. But even more sinful is saying them. So, and then يَحْفَظُ بَطْنَهُ مِنَ الْحَرَامِ, right? That he should guard his stomach from the haram. يَتْرُكُ مَا شُبِّهَ بِاهْتِمَامِ. And anything that has a shubuhat, then he should avoid that also. Doubtful things, he should avoid doubtful things. يحفظ فرجه ويتقي الشهيد في البطش والسعيد ممنوع يريد. That he should also guard his private parts, and that's related to what you eat, because if you eat haram, you will incline towards doing things that are haram. Sidi Ahmed Zarruq in the Qawaid, he said, النعمة نعمتان نعمة اللقمة وَنِعْمَةُ الصُّحْبَةِ. The blessing, this is one of his qawaid. The blessing is two blessings. The blessing of luqma, which is what you eat, and the blessing of sahba is the company that you keep. Those are the two blessings of life. What you eat and the company you keep. The reason that eating is so important, it's a great blessing, it sustains your life, but because if you eat haram, you will do haram. That's what he says, رغم أنفك, in spite of yourself. And this is why it's very important to guard your stomach from doubtful things and from haram things. And you will notice that if you eat halal food, you will feel different. Like eating halal food, you will feel different if you eat halal food. If you eat doubtful food, it's going to have an effect. Most of the food that you see now in manufactured, mass-produced is doubtful. The majority is doubtful for a number of reasons. One, they use pig fat sometimes to clean their these big machines that they have to grease their machines. All kinds of things. There's a lot of bacteria that get into pus, things that we consider najasa, get into these things. Many things. So it's better to eat local food that is grown in your local area if you can find it. Small farms, small dairies. You can get, if you're in the United States, there's still small organic farms that are trying to fight against these dominant things. So it's important for us to support them. And things are a little bit more expensive, but in the long run, they're cheaper. Because part of the problem with modern people is they don't understand economics. When I was young, one of the major concerns in the United States was trade deficits. So you guys don't remember this because you're all too young for the people from America. But when I was a kid, the thing they were constantly talking about was the trade deficits and the great threat that these trade deficits posed to American economy. But people ignored it because it was cheaper to buy Chinese goods. So they would go to the store and they would find the Chinese good and they would just buy the Chinese good. Well, every time they did that, they were undermining somebody in their own community. And so when Japanese cars came in, they said, I'm going to buy a Japanese car because it's better and it's cheaper than buying the local car. And then basically they destroyed the American auto industry. Right? So this is economics. So when you think about your economics, you have to support local communities, right? I mean, to go like here, you can go here in Turkey. Like I went to a tailor here, and all the cloth is from Turkey, right? And this is a reasonably fair trade country because people are paid reasonably well in relation to other countries, you know, the sweatshop type thing. But the cloth is from Turkey. The tailor is a really pious Muslim, right? He prays 5 prayers in the masjid. And the masjid's right next to his little tailoring shop. And so you go down there and he makes shirts for you, he makes pants for you. So instead of going to Nordstrom's or to some big company, you're actually supporting this guy who's giving sadaqah, who's taking care of his family, who's supporting a masjid, right? And then he's contributing to the economy of his not only his neighborhood, but of his country. When I was in Mecca, I used to tell people, buy made in Turkey. Because they had a choice to buy the prayer rugs that were made in Turkey, and they were actually nicer quality because the prayer rugs that I have in my house were made in Turkey that I got in Mecca and Medina. But my point was, even if they weren't as good quality, it's better to buy from Turkey, from Muslims that are making those things, than to buy from China. Right? I'm not being anti-Chinese here. I'm just talking about economics and strengthening Muslim economies and making people more aware of these things. So if you have a choice in Turkey to buy Turkish goods or made in China, you should buy Turkish goods, even if they're more expensive, even if the quality might not be as good. Because in the long run, you're getting a little better quality, a little cheaper price, you're destroying your economy. And over time, you end up like the United States that has 20% unemployment in some places, where there's no jobs. And then the only jobs they have are flipping hamburgers at Burger King, right, with the pink slime. So this is the way Muslims have to start thinking. You know, just really thinking about local economies, fair trade. And this is all part of a holistic religion, because you'll feel different. You'll feel different wearing clothes that you know were made by pious people that you're supporting, and they weren't made by exploiting people. Because he's happy as pie in his little shop there. Really, it's not a sweatshop. It's not like 1,000 people sitting in these things for long hours, and sometimes they lock the doors. They don't even let them out in the real serious sweatshops. So this is what what he's talking about. And then he says, that you shouldn't do anything until you know the hukm of Allah in it. And that's why speaking have ahkam. There's things that you can say and you can't say. And you have to all of us become more vigilant about these things. They say if you want to talk about somebody, or need to, what you should do, I mean the ulama say this, is that you should imagine them in the room. Just in your mind, imagine if they're there in the room, and then what you say, think about how they would feel about what you're saying, or how they would react. Would they get angry? Would they get defensive? And that's, and this is difficult for people in positions where you need to discuss people, because there are people, if you're working, if you have managerial positions, if you're running any organization, you're going to be involved in things. And then if you're doing things in the world, political involvement, engaging people, trying to work out what people's agendas are, things like that, because not everybody is clear about what they're doing. So then it becomes tricky, but you have to be very careful and be vigilant about it. So, alhamdulillah, it's a blessing to do a khatam of any text. And I had the good, I read this text a few times with a couple different teachers, but I have the khatam at the end of my, here, because I did the khatam, I finished it on the 5th of Sha'ban. So we're finishing it on the, 1st or the 2nd of Ramadan. Some places it's the 1st. And where we are in California, they fasted on Saturday. But in Turkey, they fasted on Friday. Is it possible to gain a firm grounding in Islamic sciences through programs like this and other courses while being a student in a completely secular system? Well, there's obviously a couple different considerations. One of them is what is the, what is it that you're trying to acquire? Because all of us are required to learn fard ayn. And the fard ayn is basically learning a sound creed, and that is either an athari creed like Imam al-Tahawi's creed, but with a proper commentary, because there are commentaries that are, they're not according to the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. They're innovative commentaries, and they're out there that have anthropomorphism and literalism that's inappropriate for certain things. Or the Ash'ari creed, and a basic creed like Umar Barahin, something like that. Because Ash'ari kalam it's a theology, so it gets into very sophisticated theology, but the basic Ash'ari kalam is not. The Umar Barahin or Ibn Ashir's Aqidah, the one you read with Dr. Omar, that's an Ash'ari creed. But that's the basic, the Ishrun Wajibah, he went over that, the 20, it's basically 13, but you have the Salbiya, and then the Sifats, the Sifat of that, Sifat the Salbiyat, and then the Sifat al-Ma'ani, and then the Ma'anawiyah. So you learn those, and that's not to limit God, but it's to give you the baseline understanding of what you mean when you say ilah. And that was done with a great amount of human thought put into that. Because the Prophet ﷺ did not bring a catechism or an organized creed like that. He gave us all of the Islamic theology is there, but it was not in a systematic presentation, like a creed. Those come later in every religion. And that's where the Asr al-Tadween, they wrote everything down, and then you came the Asr of the age where they began to actually formulate the legal schools and the theological schools. So you have to learn a creed, and then you have the Maturidi, which is what they do here. Most of the Hanafis are Maturidi. The Ash'ari and the Maturidi differ on around 13 issues. There's some debate about that, and even amongst those issues, they consider the majority of them to be semantic differences and not, does Iman increase or not increase in actual ziyadatul Iman, or is it as you increase in knowledge, you just believe in more? So people that have more knowledge, they believe in more. These are the types of debates that they got into, but these are negligible in relation to the overall picture. So you have to learn that, one of those three, as a basic. And I mentioned earlier that traditionally the people of Tasawwuf were much more in the Athari tradition. They tended not to, they didn't incline towards speculative theology. They're very strict about just learning the basic theology and then moving on, because it wasn't something. Ibn Ata'illah actually says that Allah won't ask you about his his that and his sifat about, explanations of them. You just have to believe in them. But he's going to be asking you about what you did. And he said, so you should concern yourself with what God is going to ask you about in the akhirah. And then you have to learn a basic fiqh. This is fard ayn, to learn your tahara, what najasa is, what istibra is. You have to know how to clean yourself. And then you have to know the ahkam al-salah, what's fard, what's mandub, what's sunan, in it mu'akkada, for instance, how you perform sujood al-sahu. Then you have to learn your fasting, the rules of fasting. They're not hard, but you have to learn them and know. Like, for instance, it doesn't break the fast to taste something. It's makruh. You should know that, because some people think they put food in their mouth, their fast is over. It's not. It has to go past the throat. You have to swallow it. So those are the rules that you have to learn. And then وَيَثْبُتُ الشَّهْرُ بِرُؤْيَةِ الْهِلَالِ, right? Ibn Ashur. The shahr is affirmed by the sighting of the moon. صُومُوا لِرُؤْيَتِهِ وَأَفْطِرُوا لِرُؤْيَتِهِ وَإِنْ غُمَّ عَلَيْكُمْ فَأَكْمِلُوا الْعِدَّةَ ثَلَاثِينَ, in the Sahih hadith. Fast by sighting the moon, break your fast by sighting the moon. And the Prophet said, and if it's cloudy, then complete 30 days. Khalas. It's a nas sarih. And there's no ijtihad when you have the nas. You don't make ijtihad. If there's a nas sarih, there's no ijtihad. Then you have to learn the zakat, how to pay your zakat. You have to know that if you own animals, you have to know how many animals you have to give. If you're doing commerce, you have to know what you have to pay in terms of what's, like if you're muhtakir, if you're somebody who holds goods for a higher price later, or if your goods are always in circulation, there's a difference. So you have to know those differences and know how to pay that. You have to know if you have jewelry, if it's gold jewelry or silver jewelry, you know whether or not you have to pay zakat on it. Some fuqaha say you do, some say you don't. But you have to know that, what your madhab says, and then you have to do that. Because if not, you're holding on to something and it's prohibited. You have to know what a nisab is. You have to know when zakat is due. It's a lunar month, it's not a solar month. Zakat is not income tax. You don't pay zakat on your house or on your car or something like that. Even though some of the zakat forms that they put have those things on them, those are ijtihadat of some modern people. And then you have to know about debt. And especially if you're in debt, you have to know about the zakat related, when zakat is not an obligation and when it's an obligation in relation to debt. And then you have the Hajj. You have to make it once in your lifetime. You have to learn the rules of Hajj, the 4 wajibat of Hajj. What's a rukn? What's wajib? And then you have the 4 arkan, sorry. And then you have what blood, how you rectify something that you need to rectify or redress. So that's very important. That. And then once you've learned the 5 pillars, then you have to learn what relates to whatever you're doing. So if you're a physician, you have to know the things related to awrah. You have to know those ahkam al-awrah in relation to other people. If you have to know what you can use and what you can't use. Because, for instance, alcohol is permitted, but you should know that. In doing it, it's permitted to use in medicine, even in medicines that people take, if it's necessary to preserve it, and it's the best way to preserve it. So those are the type of things that you have to learn. And then if you're in merchant selling, buying and selling, you have to learn the ahkam al-bi' wa shira. If you're going to get married, then you have to learn the ahkam of nikah. These are all fard ayn when you do them. Before you do them, they're not considered fard ayn, they're considered fard kifaya. And then you have to learn enough tasawwuf to purify your heart of the internal things that Allah has prohibited. Because the Prophet ﷺ said that لا يدخل الجنة من كان في قلبه مثقال ذرة من كبر. Right? nobody will enter paradise if they have even an atom's weight of arrogance in their heart. So you have to know how to deal with kibr. First of all, you have to know what it is. There's a difference between kibr and ujub, right? يطهر النفس يطهر القلب من الرياء وحسد عجب وكل داء. He has to purify his heart from riya and from ujub and from hasad. And so knowing those differences is really important. Kibr, you need another person to be mutakabbir. With i'jab, you only need yourself and a mirror. So vanity is something that is done, a person is vain in and of themselves. But kibr is غمط الناس بطر الحق وغمط الناس. It's to reject the truth when it comes to you, and it's to have contempt for people, seeing people as beneath you. So you have to know those, and then you have to know how to treat those things, because there are ways to treat kibr. And so tasawwuf is an important aspect of Islam, and I'm talking about tasawwuf of akhlaq, what we would call tahdhibun nafs, tazkiyatun nafs. The tasawwuf of adwaq, which is ma'rifah and suluk to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is real. And we're all going to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but people that take a path of suluk, a serious path of suluk, historically they have not been the majority of people in the majority of Muslims. So there's the path of salvation, which is just to be saved. And that's the path of the Bedouin man who came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, if I just do this, and this, am I going to paradise? He said, yes. And when he left, he said, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الرَّجُلُ إِن صَدَقَ. He'll be saved if he follows that, which was to do the 5 pillars and then consider what was halal, halal, and what was haram, haram. That was enough for the Bedouin. So that's a way of salvation, but there's a way of taqdees, of sanctification. قَدَّسَ اللَّهُ سِرَّهُ. This is what the ulama say, may Allah sanctify his soul. A sanctified being is what you call the wali al-khas. These are the awliya, and they're very rare people that are their souls are sanctified, and they will often have signs of that sanctification. And certainly the people, some of the people buried in this city, some of the people buried in this Teke were amongst those people and they leave behind themselves their presence. But when they're in the world, if people who visited some of the Salihin, like Murabtar Hajj or Habib Ahmed, these people were, if you meet them, you'll understand what I'm talking about. If you haven't met them, then may Allah inshallah enable you to meet some of those people, because they're few and far between. They're rare people, but they do exist, and they're people that spend their life really working on themselves, purifying themselves, struggling against themselves, and it's a long journey. And usually you don't see it until later in their life. You'll see the signs in their early periods of their life, but it's in the later, it's after a lifetime of doing that work that it really begins to manifest. And so that's an option for people, but that's a different path of just learning how to work on the self and the tahdib. You should have a teacher. Yashabu shaykhan arifan masadik. You should have a teacher in your religion. The Prophet ﷺ had a teacher, Allamahu shadid al-quwa. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent him Jibreel, and even though the teacher was less than the student, he still had a teacher. The Prophet ﷺ was commanded to recite the Quran to some of the Quran reciters that were masters of the Quran. Not because the Prophet ﷺ, right, but he was told to actually recite the Quran. To Ubay ibn Ka'b is one of them. And so that's an important aspect of the religion. The teachers are important, and finding a good teacher, a teacher that you trust, a teacher that you feel safe with. And then basically, so that's the fard ayn. In terms of learning the religion for preservation, this is an obligation on a group of people. فَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ, right? مِن كُلِّ طَائِفَةٍ. فَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ مِن كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ مِّنْهُمْ طَائِفَةٍ. That they shouldn't all go out. There should always be a ta'ifa of people that stay behind in order to learn the fiqh, right? لِيَتَفَقَّهُ, so that they actually learn the fiqh. And so even on jihad, they were commanded not everybody to go out, because the jihad is to protect those people, right? It's to protect them. So if everybody goes out and then they all get killed, and then there's nobody to preserve the religion, because jihad is just one means of protecting the religion from any physical threats against it. And then you have the spiritual jihad to protect the religion against spiritual threats against it, right? So this is important, that you have a group of people. That's a fard kifaya. For people that want to do that, they can do it over time. And there are scholars traditionally who, I'll give you one example. One of the greatest Mauritanian scholars, Muhammad Yahya al-Walati, he was actually an orphan, and he was taking care of his mom and his siblings. And the way he did that was by transcribing books. But he happened to have a brilliant memory, and he was incredibly intelligent. And so he actually became an alim from copying out books to sell them, because he would retain everything he copied out. And he ended up becoming a scholar. And Muhammad Yahya al-Walati, who's recognized in West Africa as one of the greatest Mauritanian scholars, he was a complete autodidact. Very rare, but it does happen. He was self-taught, didn't have a shaykh. Very rare, but it does happen. He's proof. So, learning from those things. And then you have أهمها عقائد ثم فروع تصوف وآلة بها الشروع. There's a tartib al-ulum. So the most important is aqidah. The next is furu' al-fiqh, not usul al-fiqh. You have to learn the furu' first, because those apply to you. And then you learn usul. And then the next one is tasawwuf, tazkiyah. And then alatun biha shuru' means a tool with which you begin with, which is the Arabic language. Now, fortunately, this is in Arab countries, but fortunately, in increasingly, we're creating a corpus of material that is in the English language. Just like the Turks have their own books that explain the religion to them, the South Asians in Pakistan, there are Pakistani scholars of Islam and Indian scholars of Islam who most of their knowledge has been through the vehicle of Urdu. They have tafsirs, they have books on hadith, everything. Now they do learn Arabic, but much of what they read is in Urdu. And that is increasingly happening in the West. So you can have people that know a lot about Islam and they might not know Arabic. But to become a preserver of Islamic knowledge, you have to learn Arabic. Because our canonical language is Arabic. It's the language of our liturgy. It's the language of our Sharia. And so it's important to learn it. And so to learn Arabic, you can do that over time. And then you get a baseline set of knowledges. So you learn, for instance, in fiqh, you learn a basic text, like in the Maliki madhab, al-Akhdari for prayer and tahara, or the Ashmawiyya for prayer, tahara, and fasting. And then you learn, like Ibn Ashir for the 5 pillars. You learn the Risala, which is just a summary of the whole Sharia for the most basic level. And then there's books like the Izziyya and Aqrab al-Masalik that are, or Tahdhib al-Salik. There are many, many books that are those between advanced and beginning. They're little more than intermediate, but they're so you have these in all the madhabs, and they're well-known texts, and they all say the same thing basically. The commentaries are different, but the texts are very much talking about the same thing, same abwab, same chapters, same subjects. They just have different levels of detail. And then in the Maliki madhab, the Mukhtasar Khalil is considered the book upon which fatwa is based. So it's the fatwa. And it has its limitations in the mu'amalat because a lot of the modern problems are not really dealt with. And this is one of the things Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayya said, especially in economics. There are many problems today that the classical books did not deal with because they didn't have fractional reserve banking, they didn't have inflationary problems, they didn't have the types of buying and selling schemes that exist today, many of which are haram, but not all of them. So, and then so that's fiqh, and then in Arabic, you have basic texts like the Ajurrumiya, you have Qatr al-Nada, you have the Alfiya of Ibn Malik, the Mulhat al-I'rab is an intermediate text, the Alfiya of Ibn Malik. In the classical tradition, there are now modern texts that are used, like Shad al-Arf fi Fann al-Sarf by al-Hamlawi, which is a good book, but it's not, the earlier books were memorized generally, so the people that mastered them are much stronger in Arabic. But and increasingly, we're having good materials in English to teach Arabic. So if you're trying to learn Arabic, there are some good materials out there now that are coming out. And so those things you can do, and you can continue on in your studies. There are some online courses that are developing. If you're not able to do that, Imam Afroz works with the Seeker's Guidance. They have online courses. There's other online courses. You have the Deen intensive programs that are weekend programs that are very good, what Dr. Aisha is doing. And then you have the possibility of going to somewhere like Zaytuna College. There's some good schools for the males in England and in the United States and in South Africa, in the South Asian tradition, the Darsi Nizami tradition. There's some good schools there, and there's obviously some limitations in terms of modern application, which we're all struggling with. But there's some really good scholars. Abdurrahman Yusuf, from Threshold, White Thread Press. He's doing amazing work. Imam Tahir in the Bay Area. Some of these up-and-coming young traditional scholars from the Deobandi and the Brelvi traditions that you find. So, and then, Zaytuna Institute, Zaytuna College is, what we want to do is have graduates that have a baseline education in the Islamic tradition with some understanding of the Western context for it. So it's a good program for people. I would definitely recommend it as a college liberal arts type of training. What we want to do is have a seminary branch which would focus solely on traditional madrasa curriculum with some of the tools that Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayya has given us, like Sina'at al-Fatwa, Mamali al-Dilalat, Hiwar an Bu'ad, Mu'amalat al-Amwal. He's done some really, really excellent works that are taking the tradition and making it relevant for the time that we're living in today, which is really important. Are there any prohibitions related to the sense of smell? In Maliki madhab, there's a karahiyya about smells in Ramadan, like perfume and things. But in the other madhab, I think Shafi'i doesn't have a problem with perfume, do they? What about the Hanafis? Anyway, you can ask the teachers from those. But other than that, it's not good to smell things. There's a reason why you have a sense of smell. So if something smells bad, don't smell it. right? That's why you can plug your nose and kind of get out of there. We know the endocrine system is affected by smell. Like there's some people here doing essential oils and things like that, which is a Muslim tradition of the effect of oil that it has on for health reasons. So all the bid'ah we hear about is not actually bid'ah, like mawlids, masabih, and such. Many of us have a lack of understanding of what true bid'ah is. Can you give an example of what true bid'ah is? Should we watch out in our present age? Yeah, an example of a bid'ah would definitely be like calculating Ramadan. I mean, that would be considered a bid'ah. Now, is it muharrama or makruha? You know, you're going to have a khilaf about that now. In the past, you wouldn't have, but today you will. You'll get, and some will say it's actually a bid'ah manduba. I don't think anybody could argue for its wujub, because they're trying to unify the community. But that would be an example of something the Prophet ﷺ did not do, but he actually told us not to do it, because he said sumu li ru'yatihi. And the hadith, another hadith which says faqduru in ghumma alaykum faqduru, that's considered a mujmal, which in usul it's an ambiguous phrasing. The mubayyan, the thing that clarifies it, is where it says akmilul iddata thalathina. So there's another clarifying hadith. So the argument that faqduruhu means to calculate it is completely been blown out of the water by the early scholars. With respect to regards to going one's speech, what would you suggest for someone who has a short temper with family members and tends to say things they regret? Well, I mean, first of all, welcome to the human race. You know, people, you're gonna regret things that you say, and a temper, again, is a mizaj situation. If you're a Safrawi, which you might well be if you're short-tempered, Safrawi tend to they have the most difficult time with temper, which means that that's their jihad, to really work on that. And you can work on it. People, you know, this idea, I have a short temper, as if there's nothing you can do about it. It's not true. There are things that you can do about it. There are ways, anger management, right? Get a taser gun, get your best friend, and when he tase you, don't tase me, bro. No, don't tase yourself, but spiritually tase yourself. You need to sit down and just relax and take some breaths. And where can we find more information on the 4 temperaments? Is there a book? If you read Arabic, Imam Suyuti's book on Tib goes into great detail about the temperament theory. The temperament theory is in all the traditional books of Islam. I mean, our scholars were very committed to temperament theory. In Western tradition, the Briggs-Meyer assessment, psychological assessment test, pretty much identifies the 4 temperaments. It's very similar. It's not a complete correlation, but it's very similar. So even modern science has recognized the psychological profiles. People are either introverted, extroverted, and then they, once you get that primary categorization, which the phlegmatic and melancholic are introverted, the choleric and sanguine are extroverted, that's the primary differentiation. And so you should know by your own nature, are you introverted or extroverted? And some people have a mixture of both, because you can have mixed temperaments. So sometimes you want to be alone, other times you like to be with people. But there are some people that just don't like to be alone. They always want to be in company. A sanguine temperament tends to be more like that. So, and then they're not fixed, they're not death sentences. You can work with your temperament. They all have negative qualities and they all have positive qualities. The Prophet ﷺ is a perfect balance. If you look at his mizaj, it's a perfect balance. He has the best of all 4, and he has none of the negative aspects. So he's a perfectly balanced human being. His Sahaba, the 4 khulafa, tend to fall into one of the 4 categories. Abu Bakr was probably Saudawi. But again, through spiritual practice and work, he becomes more and more like the Prophet ﷺ and more balanced. Omar is a classic Safrawi, choleric personality, but again, through spiritual practice and discipline, he's very different towards the end of his life than he was at the beginning. So all those stories where he's getting angry and all, at the end, it's Abu Bakr who's telling him, no, we need to, these people aren't paying zakat, we need to do something about it. Because Omar was more, it's all right, they're new in Islam, we need to know. So, and then Sayyidina Uthman is phlegmatic. He's a Balghami. And then Sayyidina Ali is Damawi. So they tend to, if you study their personalities, they tend to reflect those. But because of their spiritual work, they're all balanced. None of them have those. But the baseline appears to be, those four. Wallahu a'lam. Allah ta'ala a'lam. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك جزاكم الله خيرا